I'm Michelle Seeger, and I'm the Associate Director of the Sharp Center, and I am honored to welcome you to our lunch session today and to the conference. We are really thrilled to have Big Ten Commissioner Jim Delaney here as our keynote, and we are honored to have University of Michigan icon Lloyd Carr introduce Delaney. Coach Carr is former Michigan head football coach and member of the College Football Hall of Fame. He supports women's athletics and endowed a women's sports scholarship that is given annually to a female athlete at the University of Michigan. Coach Carr, yay! Coach Carr generously contributes his time and efforts to the University of Michigan and our community here in Ann Arbor. And I hope you will join me in thanking Coach Carr for being at our conference today and welcoming Jim Delaney.
Before I introduce Commissioner Delaney, I wanted to make a brief statement. As I look back at my high school and college days in the 1960s, you don't remember that. It is with real sadness, regret, and disappointment that the girls and women of my generation did not have the opportunities that Title IX has provided my daughters and millions of other women since 1972. So I want to say hurrah for Title IX. And kudos to all those who fought to gain equality for women in sport. Jim Delaney is a native of South Orange, New Jersey. He graduated from the University of North Carolina in 1970 with a degree in political science. He was an outstanding basketball player, a 3-year letterman for the legendary Dean Smith. He played in 2 Final Four tournaments, and as a senior, he was a tri-captain of the North Carolina team. In 1973, he received his law degree from the University of North Carolina, and after a year in work, he went to work for the NCAA, where he was an enforcement rep for 5 years before becoming the commissioner of the Ohio Valley Conference, where he stayed for 10 years. And in 1979, he became the Big Ten commissioner, the 5th commissioner in the history of this conference. And he's been in that job now for 23 years. Jim has been a great innovator. He has been a great spokesman, and he has been a great leader for the Big Ten Conference and intercollegiate athletics. He has also been a great advocate for the 9,500 student athletes who compete in this conference, for the sportsmanship that we did not have for a long time. And then he has been an advocate for community service and outreach in many, many communities throughout the Midwest. And he has worked to further equity and access for women athletes. I was with him frequently in my 13 years as the head coach of Michigan football. I would describe him as brilliant, honest, fair, tough, fearless, decisive, articulate, and he is a great listener. And I think that has a lot to do with the fact that he has been such a great commissioner and such a great ambassador for intercollegiate athletics. We are glad to have you at the University of Michigan, Jim. Please help me welcome Jim Delaney, Commissioner of the Big Ten.
Much appreciated, Lloyd. Lloyd is one of the not only great football coaches, but one of the great educator, leaders, coaches, people in this conference. Won national championship, won conference championships, and always stood for the right things, that did things the right way. So congratulations to you, Lloyd. Your contribution here is speaks for itself, and for you to say those things about me makes me feel awful good inside. I thought a lot about today, and what I wanted to say, what I should say, and also what I shouldn't say. And I met with Diane Dietz, who's a Michigan grad, and she works for me now. She's the all-time leading basketball scorer at the University of Michigan. She's got a law degree and has had a great career. And she's one of the people that I rely on the most to help me filter what I should say and what I shouldn't say. And also Andrea Williams, who works for me, and Andrea played basketball and volleyball at Texas A&M, and she runs our big events. She runs our women's tournament, our men's tournament, and our championship event. And she's special and talented. And those aren't the only two former women athletes that we have in the Big Ten. Wendy Wilkinson Fallon, who graduated from Michigan, was a great gymnast, a Canadian, has been with me for a long, long time, not 23 years, but probably 21 or 22 years. She just had her third child, so she's on a little leave of absence. And Jen Heppel, many of you know Jen. Jen's going to be running the hockey, the new Big Ten championship hockey program. So we've got lots of people who've had lots of great competitive experiences, and I agree with Lloyd. I think we all want to have well-organized, competitive, balanced, healthy people. And I know that when we hire, whether it's in internships or senior positions, the athletic experience, both on the men's and women's side, is important to me. Equity under law, it's been around since 1972, and I think the law is important. But so is the culture that precedes the law and the culture that changes after the law. Leadership and engagement is important, but law alone or culture alone or leadership and engagement alone are not sufficient. Resources alone are not sufficient, and programmatic consistency is not important alone. I think that what we've all experienced in the last 40 years in one combination or another are all those things where you've had success. You need the law, and you need the culture, and you need to have leadership and engagement at a variety of levels. And you need resources, and you need programmatic consistency. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about all of those factors and how they've influenced the Big Ten, at least during my tenure. I really can't speak with any personal understanding for the 70s or the 80s, but I have been here for the last 23 years, and I think we've made a lot of progress during that period of time, and yet it doesn't seem right or fair for me to do anything other than to recognize all of the people who have made the movement possible, the forward progress possible. You'll know some of the people. You'll know Christine Grant, and you'll know Judy Sweet, and you'll know Bonnie Slatton, and you'll know Percy Bates, and you'll know Mary Sue Coleman, and you'll know Luana Simon, and you'll know Donna Shalala, and you will know many of these people, but many of them you won't know. You won't know Morgan Burke or Ron Gunther, and you'll know Tom Izzo and Lloyd Carr. And you won't know all the people in our office, who made a difference, and you won't know all of the people that were necessary to create all the opportunities that we created, nor will you fully understand how important resources are. There's a lot of criticism in college athletics over its commercialization. And some of that criticism is well-earned and well-deserved. Not all of it, but some of it is. But let me just say that we were spending less than $30 million on men's and women's scholarships in 1990. Today that number is closer to $140 million. Okay? We had 6,600 total athletes. Today we have 9,500 athletes. We were 71% male, 29% female in 1990. Today we're 51-49. We have almost 300 teams playing, but under the foundation of that is not governmental support. It's not institutional support from the general fund. It does relate to the resources that are developed in our men's basketball program and football program. Like it or not, without that kind of growth, we would not have been able to maintain the opportunities that we had for the men and create the new ones for the women. It would not have been possible. But think about this, in 1991, when we did what we did and adopted the first voluntary standards for participation, we were in the middle of a recession. Okay? We were in the middle of a recession, and there was no optimism about the fact that we were going to, anytime soon, develop new revenue sources. So when you're at 71-29 and you're trying to persuade people about, because we might not have known exactly what Title IX meant. There were 3 tests, and there was lots of discussion on how you count and what test is a safe harbor and how do you get there. So that's the law. But I think there is also a history in the Big Ten going back many, 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 many generations. So when you talk about culture, Moses' Law, does anybody know who Moses' Law is? Does anybody in this room know who Moses' Law is? Percy, do you know who Moses' Law is? Moses' Law was the first African American athlete in the Big Ten, and you know when he came? 1894. Okay, he was a transfer from Oberlin College. He was a catcher on the Michigan baseball team. He came 1 year before the Big Ten Conference was thought of, and 2 years before it was founded. And so whether or not it was about Jesse Owens, or whether it was about Susie Hamilton Favor, or whether it was about Moses' Law, or about providing opportunities for African American student athletes from regions of the country that excluded them from their schools as well as their teams, or whether it was the fact that some Jewish Americans were capped in terms of how often and how many could go to particular universities. I think schools in the Big Ten were early to the game. That's part of our culture of opportunity, culture of democracy, culture of fairness. And so I think that while we may have been late to the Title IX game or the gender equity game, relatively speaking, I think it was a culture that was open and willing to change. There was disagreement, but I think from a team perspective, there were enough people. There were enough people to begin the discussion. There are trailblazers and turnaround artists and very active people, and reformers, whether it's a social movement or a turnaround artist in business. Sometimes you need a spark, and sometimes you need to put yourself out there. And we had those people. Christine was one of those people, and Bonnie was one of those people, and Percy was one of those people. But you needed other people. For a movement to take hold and for change to really occur, you need broader engagement other than just a reformer or an advocate. And we had broader engagement because our culture was wider and broader. And then I think we had people in various positions who were willing to consistently look at this over time, to measure it, to have programmatic consistency, and also to look at opportunities when they arose, because there were times and places where we did generate more revenue. There were times and places where we did make good decisions in and around expansion. And I think it's important to see how we acted when we had the opportunity to change. When Penn State was added to the Big Ten, the breadth of their program and the equity in their program was a factor. When Nebraska was added, the breadth of their program and the equity in their program was a factor. When the Big Ten Network was founded, the notion of providing a lot of television opportunities for women was an important factor. And when we tried to tell the story, I think Roone Arledge, in the 60s, when he took over ABC Sports, did a great job of bringing stories alive in the Olympic process. The thrill of victory, the agony of defeat. I think a lot of people still probably remember that skier tumbling head over heels down a slope in Innsbruck, Austria. And so, we really felt it was important to get behind the athlete, to get behind the uniform, and to really tell the story. And so we've had a Faces branding program, and we've had as many women as we have had men tell their stories, where they came from, what their dreams are, what they aspire to be, and how the experience in the Big Ten has made a difference to them. But I think you'll see that, inside the founding of the Big Ten, which is a for-profit entity, we were able to persuade Fox, and it wasn't hard. Fox takes a lot of hits, but Fox was more than willing to forego beer advertising, was more than willing to provide equal number of events for men and women across a variety of platforms, and willing to support us on telling the story that we wanted to tell. Now, it took, individuals, boards of directors, a variety of other people to create that culture, to create the ask, and it took a little bit of leverage in order to execute on that. And so I think you'll see, anytime you see the amount of progress that happened here, that you'll have the law. That's important. But the law standing by itself, if you read constitutions around the world, a lot of them use highfalutin language, but democracy only exists in about 40% of the countries worldwide. It is in danger in a lot of the places where it exists. So law alone, constitutional provisions alone, statutes alone don't do anything. You need to have receptivity. You see the Arab Spring, it's not so springtime in the Middle East right now because they don't have institutions, culture, and customs that really are supportive of the kinds of laws that people aspire to. And so I think in the Big Ten, we have been able to make change. It's partially due to the law. It's largely due to the culture, the leadership that came from reformers, but also I think a broad base of support. And it also allowed for the creation of a lot of wealth. Okay, we had $220 million of revenue 23 years ago. Today we have over $1 billion of revenue. And there is quite a bit of criticism about how much coaches make, how much commissioners make, how big our stadiums are. But there is no growth at the level that we've had it, with the quality of opportunities that we've had, without that growth. Because what is true today was true 20 years ago, which was true 40 years ago. There are two sports that are engaged with by the public through television. Now we're trying to grow attendance. We're trying to grow television. We're trying to grow the dream for young kids to show them how important sports and athletics can be in their life. But that doesn't change the fact that when you go into the marketplace, there are only two sports that command any kind of real commercial attention. But what we've tried to do is justify that in part by the experience for those athletes, but also because of the resource development that it allows us to do to provide opportunities and equity for lots of young men and lots of young women, and do it in a way that is not only consistent with the law, but is also consistent with the values that the institutions of this conference have come to expect of themselves over a long period of time. So we have made some progress. We feel good about it. We know there's more to do. We know that there's another step. I think, however, where we were was a place where we could not stay. 71-29. So what happened in those committee rooms a long time ago? And I kind of remember, Christine, I remember the room that we were in when we were talking about the 60-40, because nobody really had ever established a number internally. This was not a Title IX number, okay, because there are a variety of tests and safe harbors. But I knew this, whatever the number was, it wasn't 71-29. And the number 50-50, which was a number that sort of resonated for a lot of people, wasn't achievable within 5 years, okay? By any stretch of the imagination. We didn't have the resources, we didn't have the political will, we didn't have the means, we didn't have the plan. So it's like asking a quarterback to throw the ball, drawing up a play that's a 40-yard out, and the quarterback can't throw the ball except 20 yards. So what we needed to do was come up with an interim step that was doable, that was achievable. Yeah, there were people who disagreed with it, but the reality was that it was amazing to me how we got there. And it wasn't without a little bit of pain, because if you look at the handout in front of you, you'll see we gained 1,300 opportunities. We added 800 on the women's side, and we lost 500 on the men's side. Okay, long term, we didn't lose. We gained, we grew. But in the short term, to get from where we were at 71-29 to 60-40, we had a juxtaposition of 1,300 opportunities, 800 created, and did those 500 disappear? Probably playing opportunities, not, but probably being on a team, yes. Because we had 135, 140 players going to practice in football, sitting on the bench, probably not getting a playing opportunity, but they got a participation opportunity. And so we limited the number of kids. This is the truth, and this should be known, because we limited the number of opportunities of kids who could walk on, stay on. We cut scholarships by 10% across the board on the men's side. That's why you'll see 15 scholarships for women's basketball players and 13 for men. And so we did things that weren't easy to do, but they were doable, okay? And so as time went on and we were able to develop more resources, some of these restraints, I think were able to come off a bit. But still, even at 60-40, that was not where a safe harbor existed ultimately. But what was remarkable is once the momentum for change was created by a combination of restraint and change on one hand and adding opportunities on the other and spending some money that we really probably didn't have and reallocating some, the momentum from 1996-97 through 2001-2002 was there. And we turned around and we were at 55-45 without a mandate, without anything else, because I think people, became comfortable with the change. There was momentum there, there was more resources there, and there was a platform and a pathway to that. And then as time has gone on, we've continued to inch closer to 50-50. I think the quality of opportunities has gone up. I think the academic support has gone up. I think the facilities have improved. And I think that we've been fortunate because we've had the resources. So here, it took a major change in the law to set the ceiling. It took a certain amount of cultural receptivity. It took a certain amount of leadership by key people who are change agents, reformers, call them what you want. They put their necks out and they took some heat. And they weren't always appreciated for that at the time. In retrospect, yes, but they fought from their heart, they fought from their mind, and they fought from their soul. They believed it. So without that, you're not going to have the triggers for change. But beneath that level, that by itself and the law is not enough. This conference was never sued. There may have been some investigations and there may have been some pressure. But essentially, you could talk to a lot of people in this conference about change, and you don't get the kind of change we got in the 90s without having what I would describe as a very receptive set of values to experience the kinds of growth that we've had. The conference has got a history. It's tied to the East. The very broad-based programs you see in the Ivy League are replicated here in many, many ways. There are conferences with the same amount of resources that we have that do not have 9,500 athletes. The number would be closer to 6,000. That do not have 300 programs. The number would be closer to 225 programs. So it's about a philosophy, it's about a history, and it's about a culture. Because you can comply with this law in a lot of different ways, but that doesn't necessarily require 9,500 athletes in order to do it. You could do this with 6,000 athletes. But this conference believes in lots of opportunities for lots of people to compete across a broad array of sports. Much like our universities, they could be great and they could be narrow, or they could be great and they could be broad. And they happen to be very broad in terms of public service, in terms of education, and in terms of research. So what I found from Donna Shalala or Mary Sue Coleman or Luana Simon was a real receptivity to change and to moving forward in a progressive way. But I found the same thing from Jim Duderstadt and Hunter Rawlings, okay, and Graham Spanier. These were people of really goodwill who really wanted to do the right thing, who never stood in the way of what was an effort to move the dial. They said, don't be dumb about it, don't be stupid about it, don't undermine the resources that we need to have and our ability to compete. But if you can do it, we'll support you as you try to do it. But, you know, to say that it was about me, or to say it was about Christine, or to say it was about Bonnie or Percy only would be wrong. Those were really key players, but you had literally thousands of people, fathers and mothers and coaches and dads, television commentators, and the media who believed that this was the right direction to go in. In a lot of cases, the question was how to. How do we do it? And in our case, I think that, you know, we took a baby step. But a lot of times, a baby step is important, because you can't get from point A to point C without going to B. And you cannot if you try to get from A to C without going to B. And I remember sitting next to Christine. She may not remember it, but she thought, hey, that's pretty good, 60-40. So she could have said, no, that doesn't work. That's not acceptable. That's not where we're going. Because a lot of times you're in a negotiation, and you'll say, you know, I want to get here, but I can only get here. Somebody's got to say, yeah, that's okay to do. That's okay. Doesn't mean you agree to it indefinitely, but it does agree that for now this is a right place to go. So I appreciate the attitude of everybody on the advocacy side, on the side that certain people had to give certain things up, on the side of having to stay competitive, because I will tell you this, if we don't compete, we don't have the resources. Now, there are other situations. There are high school situations. There are junior college situations. You know, this country is, one of the great things about it is the diversity of education, both at the secondary level and at the college level. And a lot of people don't have the resources, so they're going to have a whole different set of strategies. But we're fortunate that we had the resources, the people, the culture, the change agents, and the support from a whole variety of groups. And so for that, I'm thankful. I'm glad we got done what we got done. I think it's a great way to experience life. In fact, there are things that you know and I know can only be learned in a team environment, cannot be learned in English class, cannot be learned in a science laboratory. Those are great formal educational settings, but I think we all know that being on a team, learning to subordinate yourself to others, learning to sacrifice for a larger entity, learning to accept defeat with a little bit of humility, learning to accept victory with a little humility, learning to accept defeat in the right way, to stay resilient, to persevere, are things that athletics teaches. These things can be learned other places, I understand that, but I don't think that there's, for those of us who've experienced it and value it and have lived it, I don't think there's a real substitute. And for that, you know, I'm just glad to have been part of what I think is progress, and to be in the Big Ten at a time when these kinds of things were challenged and some modicum of progress was made. So with that, let me stop here and see if you have any comments or questions. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm Bernice Sandler, role in the development of Title IX, So I wanted to ask you a question. What was the hardest part? All the changes that have to be done. What was the most difficult?
The question was, what was of the things that had to happen and change, what was the hardest part? That's a good question. I for one reason or another, find myself in a lot of situations in life where there's a fair amount of conflict. And I know that you have also. I've read about your life. A fair amount of conflict. And I think that probably there's a level of conflict management, or if you're involved in the actual change and trying to keep people engaged and not walking away on both sides, that sort of tests you the most. I was fortunate. My dad taught in an inner city when, we were the only white kids on the playground. And I was from a neighborhood in New Jersey where, the people on both sides of my houses were off the boat from Italy or from Portugal or from Ireland or England, and then lived abroad myself as a young kid where you were the odd man out. So, and Lloyd knows this. He was, I get in as many fights with the football coaches as I do with the gender equity advocates, okay? I don't mind fighting, and I don't mind exchanging. And, I think as long as you go into the room together in good faith, and you leave the room together, and you're willing to try to compromise, figure out a way, I think everybody feels good about that. I think they feel good about that in a commercial transaction. I think they feel good about that inside of a family. And I think they feel good about that in social change, because people, I think, want to do the right thing. I think a lot of times the pathway, the rhetoric, the ideology, stops people from coming together and charting a course. And I think that's where democracy and the institutions and customs of democracy have it so far above any other system, because it allows for evolution and change. And I know that this is not evolution because, there were no opportunities, 40 years ago, and now there are a lot. So that's pretty substantial change in a pretty short period of time. But I do think that receptivity, this would be harder to have done in other environments. But I think that the Big Ten institutions have kind of a unique democratic environment. Garrison Keillor spoke at our 100th centennial, and I think he really spoke to the publicness of Big Ten institutions and how important they've been to the growth of the Midwest and the health of higher education in America. And I feel in many ways that, intercollegiate athletics in the Big Ten stands for some of those same kinds of things. Winning is important, but, winning the right way is important as well. So I think it's the conflict that people, and I don't like conflict, but, some people think I do, but I don't. But I think that the alternative to conflict a lot of times is sort of resignation and paper shuffling, and I don't do either one of those very well. Yep. Yeah.
How do we get athletic conferences to take the lead in adding new sports for women? So often schools will say, well, I'm not going to add that sport because nobody else in my conference plays it, or nobody else in my region plays it. But yet, if the conference got together and said, you know what, why don't we add women's lacrosse in 2 years? Boom, you could have instant competition and there would be no more excuses about, gee, there's nobody to play. How do we get more athletic conferences to do the right thing in that way to expand opportunities by adding new sports?
I think conferences play a kind of a balanced or unique role with institutions. Sometimes they lead them a bit, sometimes they reflect. With regard to, championships, we've tended to reflect more than we've had to lead. And it's because when you come to a meeting and you have limited resources on a campus and you're looking at your array of offerings, they look around the table and say, well, you got 12 championships here, 13 championships here. I think Michigan has added lacrosse when, women's lacrosse is not real big in the conference, but it's important for them, partially because of where they draw their students from, and partially because probably lacrosse is a grassroots sport that, has left Long Island and the Maryland-Baltimore corridor. It's come into the Midwest. I know it's come into Chicago. So I expect you'll see that, but typically you're going to get, the high schools feeding the colleges, and then the grassroots feeding the high schools, and the high schools feeding the colleges. And if you go to a conference meeting and you're looking at alternatives and best ways to go, and you have got one or two schools sponsoring a team, the notion that the other 9, okay, because we are kind of a democratic group, are going to vote to put in teams that are not, widely sponsored in the states that our schools are located is just probably uphill. I don't think that's a strategy where the conference tells the schools which sports to sponsor. regardless of the sports that are sponsored in those states. So I would say that's a strategy which wouldn't have a lot of traction in a lot of the meetings I've been at.
Commissioner,
Yeah,
please talk, you mentioned about Andrea Williams.
yeah.
Can you talk about the progress of black females in your conference regarding the trajectory?
I don't know. Andrea is just one of my favorite people. She's talented, administrator, pretty good athlete. Comes from a wonderful family in San Antonio. His father, her dad is career military. Her brother sent me. He's a retired military. We were out at the Carrier of Michigan State versus North Carolina on the J. Vincent. That wasn't the right. Yeah, Yeah, that was Carl Vincent. Carl Vincent was the ship that delivered Osama bin Laden to the bottom of the sea, and it was the venue for the Michigan State North Carolina basketball game. And her brother was out there and went to the game with us. So she's talented, valued employee, and a good friend.
What about others? Progress in regards to that?
Well, we've had a variety of people in our operation. She's I would say, the senior ranking African American female that we have, but we've had others. We've had a young woman who's out at the Big East now. Percy, what was her name? Young woman. Basketball player at Illinois State. We've had a variety of people come, but she would be the most well-known senior administrator that we've had. We've had internship programs, entry levels. Any other questions? Yeah.
Role, Commissioner, and your leadership role, how have other conferences, have they stepped up and kind of seen what you've done and maybe taken steps towards your direction?
I think the numbers have improved around the country. We've been fortunate in that we've had, I think, maybe more what I would describe as programs, consistency of programs over time, because the initial effort was on participation, but that was followed by the Dream Big campaign, which was followed by, a measurement of attendance and trying to stimulate attendance. And, with the Big Ten Network, we've been able to go to the Faces campaign and tell the stories and the narratives behind the athlete. So I think that, part of what we've done has been sort of because of our profile and because of our positioning, and also, to be honest with you, because of our resources. We've had, so fortunate to develop these resources, and I'm very reluctant to kind of judge others. It's like looking at a family with a lot of resources and understanding that there's enough for all 6 children to go to colleges of their choice and leave debt-free. And then looking at another family where they're trying to scrape together the necessary means to treat everybody equally. And somebody's at a community college, somebody's at a junior college, somebody's working in the summertime. And so, I think that we had that combination of resources and culture and law to allow us and personalities to move forward. And I think that, and some conferences simply don't have the same commitment to breadth of program that we have. But even with regard to breadth of program, and we have 300 programs, it's important to tell the truth that the biggest programs, the broadest programs, are the ones with the largest football stadiums. Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Nebraska have the broadest programs because they have the resources. And so when you have the resources, you have the responsibility, and you also have the opportunity. And so I know when I was in the Ohio Valley Conference for 10 years, we didn't have any resources. It was much harder. I mean, it's hard to have the conversation, and it's harder to have the programs, and it's harder to make progress. And so, I think that there aren't many conferences that have the opportunity that we have as a result of the resources we have. So, I think there's been a lot of progress. Some don't believe in the breadth of program like we do, but they have achieved equity and compliance with the law, but they haven't done it maybe as a robust a way because they just come from a kind of a slightly different view of how intercollegiate athletics ought to fit. Yep. Okay, thank you very much.
It is my real pleasure to introduce Joanne Bernice. She's a reporter at the Detroit Free Press and a longtime Olympics writer. And we're so lucky to have her here with us, as well as Bernice Sandler. I will turn the floor over to Joanne, who will say a few words about Bernice, and then Bernice will say a few words. Then they'll have a conversation and with each other and with you. So enjoy the session. Joanne.
Thank you. I have the pleasure of introducing an incredible woman, really one of the most important women in the history of not only Title IX, but the decades leading up to that landmark legislation. Her name is Dr. Bernice Sandler, and yay! Woo! And before I tell you a little bit more about her, I have to say that I spent 15 minutes with her yesterday sitting on a pair of folding chairs in the lobby outside the auditorium here. And I was so inspired by her enthusiasm and commitment and easygoing manner that last night, after Layla Ali's keynote, I was going to ask if she wanted to hang out and have a couple of beers at Casey's, but alas, I had to work. You'll find out why in a minute, just how incredible she is. A few days ago, I Googled her name, Dr. Bernice Sandler, and in an instant, it spewed back about 188,000 results. Then I Googled the nickname that she has been known as, Godmother of Title IX, and another 20,000 more popped up. Dr. Sandler has been associated with the legislation of Title IX longer than any other person. After receiving her doctorate in counseling and personnel services from the University of Maryland, Dr. Sandler sought out a faculty position for which she was qualified for. She was denied the position because she was told she came on too strong for a woman. Ever since encountering that act of discrimination, Dr. Sandler has fought for the rights of women in the field of education. While volunteering for the Women's Equity Action League from 1969 to 1971, Dr. Sandler worked to enforce an executive order signed by President Lyndon Johnson that prohibited sex discrimination within organizations with federal contracts. While most universities did not have policies eliminating gender discrimination, most had federal contracts. Dr. Sandler filed sex discrimination complaints against 250 institutions under this executive order. With Representative Edith Green, she went on to spearhead hearings that documented discrimination in employment and educational opportunities. These hearings led to the passage of Title IX and other laws eliminating overt discrimination in education. Dr. Sandler has been part of many firsts in the fight for gender equity. Here are a few. In 1970, she was the first person to testify before the U.S. Congress about gender discrimination in education. Working with the U.S. Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, she wrote the first federal policy regarding sex discrimination in education. As a result of these efforts, Dr. Sandler was appointed to the chair of the first Federal Advisory Committee on Women's Educational Equity. Dr. Sandler is a senior scholar at the Women's Research and Education Institute in Washington, D.C. She co-authored The Chilly Classroom Climate, a guide to improve the education of women, and Sexual Harassment on Campus, a guide for administrators, faculty, and students. She has written more than 100 articles and delivered more than 2,500 presentations. She has served on more than 30 boards. She has 14 honorary doctorates and has received numerous awards. One was last month when she was recognized by the NCAA at halftime of the Women's Final Four, where she was honored for her contributions to women's sports. As you will soon find out, it's not surprising to me that she has embraced social media. She has her own page, BerniceSandler.com. I clicked it on the other day and smiled. The background or wallpaper has a picture of a snow-capped mountain. Its message is clear: aim high. It's my honor to introduce Dr. Bernice Sandler.
Thank you. Thank you for such a nice. Let's get that coming back. I will. Oh. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I have to say two things before I get started. Is one, in every speech I give, the first row is almost virtually empty, and I am hoping that someone will know an architect who will design an auditorium where the first row sinks into the floor and the podium goes forward. The second thing I want to say is that this podium, I would guess, probably predates Title IX. And the reason I know that is when I started speaking, they were all this high. I'm standing on a little box, you should know. And they were all, and I developed this habit of popping up and standing on my toes, which I still occasionally do. So I'm hoping that maybe someday someone will make a donation to the Rackham School and come up with a regular-sized podium. They're all much smaller now, so that short women actually can use them and see over it. Title IX is, and I didn't know this, we didn't know how important Title IX was when we were starting, but it has turned out to be probably the most important law passed for women and girls in Congress since women obtained the right to vote back in 1920. And I want to bring you back, not to 1920, but I want to bring you back to the 1960s before Title IX is passed, and to give you some sense of what it's like. The women's movement is just a few years old. There's very little awareness of sex discrimination. The words sexism and sexist have not yet been invented. There's no word for sexual harassment. There's no word for date rape, acquaintance rape, or gang rape. Those words just were not in the lexicon at all. There's not even much interest in women's issues except for a few small women's groups, a few men of goodwill, and some negative members of the press. This is before the web. This is before email. There are no newsletters at all dealing with women's rights and discrimination. There are no conferences like this. I remember saying to someone, wouldn't it be great if we could have a conference on women? I mean, it was a dream. And of course, now you couldn't even keep up with the conferences that they are. So it's very difficult for women to exchange information, to even get to know who is interested in working on women's issues. I want to tell you that campus discrimination was rampant. We're not finished solving it all, but it was really much worse then. It's rampant, but it's often not noticed. So I want to give you some examples. A letter was sent to me by a woman who applied for a position at one of our more prestigious small New England colleges, and she got this answer: your qualifications are excellent, but we already have a woman in this department. Many undergraduate schools limited the number of women who would be admitted. Michigan was one of the better ones. Their quota was only 45% of the student body, but that was much more than some other places. I lived in Ann Arbor, incidentally, for about 6 years, many years ago, and so I have some Ann Arbor, University of Michigan examples. But I want to tell you what happened in Virginia. During a time period, 3 years, during the early 1960s, there were 21,000 women who were rejected for admission to Virginia state colleges and universities. Now, how many men would you guess were rejected during the same period? Anyone want to take a guess? How many? Zero. Absolutely right. Most people don't get that, so that's really good. The School of Veterinary Medicine at Cornell University, like many schools of medicine, many schools of law, they had a fixed quota for women. At Cornell, for the veterinary school, it was 2 women per year. No matter how many applied, no matter how wonderful and qualified the women were, only 2 would be admitted. In some colleges, women could not major in certain fields, like chemistry. In some places, they couldn't even take courses in chemistry. My daughter could not take a course in high school auto mechanics because the boys used bad language, and had I known more, I would have said they should have heard my daughter's language and they would have let her in. As a child, I had 3 things I wanted to do and couldn't because I was a little girl. I wanted to operate this class slide projector, which was really high-tech stuff in those days. I wanted to fill the ink wells with ink. I don't know why that was something I wanted to do. And I wanted to be a crossing guard, but I could not do any of those things. And now girls can. That's the good news. In 1969, I just want to repeat a little bit of what Joe said. I had finished my doctorate. I'd been teaching at the University of Maryland part-time while getting it, and I'm still teaching part-time after I got it. There was a huge expansion, 7 openings in my department, and they don't even consider me. So I'm hurt. My mother had taught me when things go wrong, you ask to find out why. So I went and I went to one of the faculty members and I said, how come they didn't even consider me? And without skipping a beat, he said, you come on too strong for a woman, let's face it. I was horrified. I went home. I did not know at the time that those 5 words, too strong for a woman, would not only change my life, but the lives of many millions of women and girls, because they led to the passage of Title IX. Instead, I went home and I cried. I blamed myself for speaking up a few times at staff meetings. I have to tell you, this is years ago. I really wanted to be a lady, and I was much more sweet and demure, less confident, and all of those things, so it was even more inappropriate then than it would be now. I blamed myself for speaking up in classes as a graduate student. In short, I accepted the assessment that I was too strong for a woman. It was my then husband who really helped me understand what's going on. He said, are there any strong men in the department? And weeping copiously, I said, yes. And then he said the right words. He said, then it's not you, it's sex discrimination. And that changed my perception of what was going on. It wasn't my fault. It was the way things were, and that was not a good way for things to be. I had been somewhat ambivalent about the women's movement. I halfway believed the press descriptions of its supporters as abrasive, women-hating, man-hating, bitches, castrating bitches, unfeminine, radical, bitchy women, whatever. And surely I was not like those kinds of women. But I finally figured it out that maybe I was in some way, or at least, at least the descriptions were not correct, but I was like the women who were being called that. Now, I very naively assumed that because sex discrimination was wrong, I now knew that it must be illegal. So I started reading up and quickly learned that all of the laws that prohibited sex discrimination in employment or in the Equal Pay Act or in Title IV of the Civil Rights Act, all of them, for one reason or another, exempted women as teachers, faculty, administrators, professionals, and women as students and girls as students. So there's absolutely no protection. Even the 14th Amendment of the Constitution had never, this 14th Amendment says equal protection of the laws. Well, at that time, it had never been deemed applicable to sex discrimination. So there is no legal protection whatsoever. So I began reading how African Americans had ended desegregation, because I thought they've really done it, so I'm going to have to figure out what they did. Maybe I can get some ideas. I'm reading a report evaluating the enforcement of civil rights legislation prepared by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, and it's interesting. I'm reading about all these laws and so. And then there's an article on a presidential executive order. I didn't even know what that was, but the president can issue some of these. And I'm reading, and it says federal contractors, people who have contracts with the government, they're not allowed to discriminate in employment on the basis of race, color, religion, national origin. And there's a footnote. I'm an academic. I read footnotes. And I went to the footnote, and it said, the Executive Order 11246 had recently been amended to cover sex discrimination by Executive Order 11375. It was a genuine eureka moment. I was alone in the house, and I literally shrieked, because I made the connection that there was a protection for at least employment in terms of women in colleges that had federal contracts. Now, I had recently joined a small women's rights group, the Women's Equity Action League, WEAL, which was started by an attorney in Ohio, and so I began to work on some of these issues. I became the I became the chair of the Federal Contract Compliance on the Action, what was the title? I was chair of the Action Committee for Federal Contract Compliance. I was the only member of the whole committee. But I was learning political strategies from a lot of other good women and men who told me how to say things and whatnot. I subsequently met with someone from the Office of Federal Contract Compliance in the government. His name was Vincent Macaluso. I didn't give his name because he was still employed there for many years. He gave me all kinds of secret advice and actually wrote the first class action complaint against all colleges and universities in the United States that held federal contracts. Other women's organizations, particularly one at the University of Michigan here, filed charges, and so that was important too. And women would call or write me, I mean, this is before email, they would call me about their institution, and I'd say, gather some data in your department and maybe 5 other departments about the number and percentage of women at each level, associate, assistant associate, full professor, and then send it to me because you could file a statistical complaint under this executive order. And it turned out the data that the federal government was the percentage of women with doctorates in particular fields. So you could say if there were 20% of the doctorates, like in psychology, there were 22%, there maybe should be 10 or 15% of the people there would be women. Well, it turns out they weren't. I may give you 2 figures. One for the University of California in Berkeley. The last time they had found a woman who was qualified to be hired in their department of psychology had been in 1924. Okay? Similarly, at Harvard, there were 411 tenured professors in the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences. Again, remember your answer from before. How many do you think were women? 0, exactly. The percentage of women faculty in higher education was lower in 1969 than it had been 30 years earlier in 1929. So you can see there are real disparities. Something's going on here. I lost my place, so I'm going both ways. Hold on one sec while I find it. Here I am, okay. The group that I had joined, WEAL, the Women's Equity Action League, had managed to get several women members of the Congress on their advisory board. And so they knew when I was filing complaints. I was sending copies of them and letting them know that I had filed complaints against X number of universities. And one of the people there was Representative Edith Green, a Democrat from Portland, Oregon. She's the mother of the Equal Pay Act. She's also the mother of Title IX. But she was the mother of the Equal Pay Act, which precedes the Civil Rights Act of 1964. So she knew what discrimination was about. She had wanted to change the law so that these other laws, or new law, would cover women in higher education and girls as well, in higher and lower education. And she didn't have a constituency. There's very little data. The government hardly gets anyone. Collects any data. I come along with all this data that these women all over the country are sending me, and I'm giving it to her. And she realizes she has a constituency, and she has the data. And so she introduces, in 1970, she introduces the bill. She holds hearings on it. It's the first hearings ever held specifically concerning discrimination against women and girls in education. I gave the overview testimony. I recommended a lot of the witnesses who would testify, and then got hired to put the written record together. So I've been involved with this for quite a long time. Now, whenever legislation is introduced, and if it's important legislation, you hold hearings on it. And the people you invite to testify are people who have a stake in that particular proposed bill, and who usually belong to organizations, and some may be for the bill you're introducing, some may be against it. You want to hear both sides. You want to know what the impact of this bill is, and these are the experts. Well, the expert in higher education is the American Council on Education, which some of you may recognize. Virtually every president in the country belongs to it. They do lots of good things, but they are the lobbying arm of higher education. And so the lobbyist at the American Council on Education is called by the staff member of the committee that's introducing this bill and asked if they would like to testify. And his response, and this is almost verbatim, was, there is no sex discrimination in higher education, and besides, it's not a problem. Wow. This is the biggest break we could have gotten, because if anybody analyzed that bill, which they would have done, they would have figured out eventually, as I and the other people working on this eventually figured out, that it was going to cover athletics. But they were not watching, and that was very good. And because the word sports doesn't appear anywhere in the bill, nobody's thinking of athletics at all. And so nobody's really following it, and people see it as a very minor bill. I have to tell you, around this time, I'm beginning to get letters from faculty members and women and men, administrators, and they ask, is there really sex discrimination in higher education? Because most of us who notice it don't understand how bad it is or even that it exists in some ways. Most of the hearing dealt with faculty and professional employment because they were the first groups to organize and gather data about their own work experience as a group. And we had 1,200 pages of data from those hearings. We also had a good deal of data on documentation of the status of minority women in relationship especially to sex discrimination, which is brand new. These are all brand new issues. Nothing like it had ever been published, and it was an eye-opener for everyone. Senator Birch Bayh comes into the picture. He's the father of Title IX. He's a Democrat, was Democrat from Indiana, and also a member of the Women's Equity Action League's advisory board. And he is the manager in the Senate, and he manages it very well in the Senate. But again, nobody's noticing. A few people do notice something, and they get everyone who noticed something got an exemption. Somebody said, what's going to happen to fraternities and sororities? So they're allowed to have single-sex memberships. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, and a couple of other youth organizations are exempted from Title IX. There's even an exemption for college beauty pageants, and if you're interested, you can ask a question about that later. But there's one thing. One member of the Senate, I no longer remember who, needed some reassurance that women would not be allowed to play football. And so they have a prearranged thing to get it in the legislative history, and he says, will women play football? And Senator Birch Bayh says, certainly not. And that's the end of it. That's the whole thing in the legislative record about athletics. So here we are. Shortly before passage, a small group of us from various women's groups, we meet with Representative Green, and we say, we're ready to lobby, Mrs. Green. And she says, do not lobby. What? Do not lobby? This is a really important bill. And she says, if you lobby, people will ask questions. And if they ask questions, they're going to find out what's in this bill. And if they find out what's in this bill, they're not going to vote for it. She was also a much smarter politician than we were at that point. So there was no lobbying for Title IX. I am now reading occasionally in history and in histories of the times, and also in people's obituaries, that they marched for the passage of Title IX. And I find that somewhat amusing, but they're usually dead, so I can't follow up on this. The language of Title IX closely follows that of Title VI of the Civil Rights Act. It covers all colleges and universities, with the exception of two who refuse to take federal money, so they don't want to comply with federal regulations, including Title IX. It covers all public K through 12 schools because they get federal monies too. Some private element K through 12 also get some money, and they are covered if they have it as well. It also covers employment, and employment is very important, and we'll come back to that later. The enabling clause, and I really love these words, so I'm just going to read them aloud. No person shall, on the basis of sex, be excluded from participation, be denied the benefits of, or subjected to discrimination under any educational program receiving federal financial assistance. And it covers almost everything unless there's a specific exemption. And that's why the word sports is nowhere in Title IX, because it's not exempt. In any event, 40 years ago in June 1972, Title IX of the Education Amendments was passed, and President Nixon then signed the bill in June. And there was, I wish I had saved the newspaper the next morning, because it said, Education Amendments passed, and there are long summaries of every title, except for Title IX, which has one sentence: it prohibits sex discrimination in federally funded programs. And that was it, because nobody really knew how important this was going to be. The next phase is the bill is now a law. And those wonderful words that I read you, somebody has to figure out, well, what does this mean? What does it mean in terms of things like athletics, and other important issues. And it took 3 years for the for the Office for Civil Rights to come up with proposed regulations. Some of it's fairly easy because you look at race discrimination cases and what you do is you just integrate. If they're not letting women take chemistry courses, you let them in, and that's pretty easy to figure out how to handle that kind of example. Quota systems and admissions to schools, God, and so forth and so on. So essentially, you're doing, with a few minor exemptions, separate but equal is not going to be allowed. But there's one place you need some separate but equal, and that's in sports. Essentially, Title IX says you can't categorize by sex, but sports is the one place where you really need to do that. And strict integration will not work. The National Collegiate Athletic Association, NCAA, at this point does not handle women's sports. It does now. Women's sports are handled by Intercollegiate Athletic Association for Women. Chris Grant played a huge role in that, and she is here today. If you haven't spoken to her, you might want to seek her out. In any event, the Male Athletic Association, College Athletic Association, is close to hysteria. We are talking big money. We are talking real power. Where will the money come from to fund athletics for women? We're talking about the masculine mystiques. We're talking about all hell breaking loose in Washington concerning athletics. And indeed, legislation is introduced to weaken Title IX, its coverage of athletics, to exempt football profits, even though many schools lose money. And all of these attempts fail, and Title IX remains intact. But the discrimination against women in collegiate athletics is really, really bad. And my office did the first study with Margaret Dunkel describing the kinds of inequities that women were then facing in sport and in athletics. And I just want to give you a few examples of how bad it was. University of Michigan, their budget is $1 million for men's varsity sports. What do you think it is for women's varsity sports? 0, right. I'm going to give you 2 examples of, because I'm running out of time here, I'm talking long. Okay. University of Minnesota, no budget for women gymnasts for athletic tape to bind their wrists. The nice men give them their sweaty, used, grungy tape. An athlete is injured at another school. The doctor says, put ice on it. She sprained her ankle, and the male athletic director refuses to give ice. That's for men only. And the coach, the athletic director, says, tell her to put her foot in the toilet and keep flushing it. The inequities are absolutely awful, really, really bad. Number of court cases go to Title IX. It covers employment, it covers sexual harassment, it covers peer-to-peer sexual harassment. It also incidentally covers sexual assault, which is becoming a big issue, and I hope some people will do some research on sexual abuse of women college athletes and bullying by male athletes, and sexual assault and violence against women by male athletes. So that becomes important and a new issue which we need to look like. So let me tell you what Title IX has accomplished and what it didn't, what we still need to do. Increased awareness. Nobody had any idea how bad things were, and the awareness went way up as a result of Title IX. And as a result of awareness, women become a new advocacy group, particularly in colleges and universities. Sometimes this was dangerous. Many women were fired, lost their jobs, were never hired again. Most, but not all, of the overt policies and programs and practices that excluded girls and women were abolished. Not all of them, but they made a huge difference. Many women got equity raises and so forth. But there was thousands of smaller inequities that one hardly noticed that were changed. The University of Maryland had maids for the men's dormitories, but not for the women's dormitories. In high school, there were career days for boys, and girls were given fashion shows instead of attending career days. Most of the changes didn't occur just because there was a court case or because there was a law. It was usually somebody who called and said, this is wrong. We need to do something about it, and so then it would get changed eventually. The women's issues have been institutionalized, like the Sharp Institute. There are people on this campus who deal with sexual harassment. There are prevention programs for sexual assault and so forth and so on. Research and data about women is now legitimate knowledge. It would have been unthinkable to have this conference in 1970. If you had raised it, someone would have said, "Are you crazy?" When I was doing my doctorate, I wanted to do research on how young women made decisions on college, going on their future careers, and I told this to my advisor, and he said, "Research on women? That's not real research. No, find another topic." And indeed I did. Here's some of the bad news. Most of the accomplishments that I've just talked about are far less in K through 12. Lots of reasons for this, but one big reason is that schools of education do not teach Title IX generally, except if you take the course on laws affecting education. And so that's a big one. Girls are still often discouraged from entering certain fields and so forth. Enforcement by the Office for Civil Rights, not enough money, not enough budget, and so forth. Sports is still a major issue. We have a number of lawsuits both at the college level and more at the lower K through 12. Some of them have had six-figure settlements, and they're very nice when they happen. We need more training. Sexual harassment, student-to-student sexual harassment, and sexual bullying are big issues, and we will be seeing more of that. During the Bush administration changed the regulation to allow single-sex classes and programs in K through 12. They're very sex stereotyped. In one of them, they said, we would like to have single-sex classes because our boys need to learn to be heroes and our girls need to learn to be more feminine. There are about 1,000 of those courses now. When Title IX was passed, I thought we would solve everything in 1 year. We would tell people you're discriminating, and they would say, "Oh, I am so sorry. Thank you for telling me." And they would stop. I have since learned it takes more than that to end discrimination. And we are ending discrimination, but it takes a long, long time. We did not realize also that how long it takes just to change sex discrimination, change the policies. And we didn't realize that we weren't only talking about ending discrimination. We're talking about a social revolution. We're talking about a social revolution that will have as much, maybe more impact than the Industrial Revolution had. We are talking about changing the roles of men and women in relationship to each other, and that is hard to do. It will take many generations, but we are all taking the very first steps of what will be a very long journey. If anyone had told me back in '72 that I would be standing here today still talking about these issues, I would have wept. But I don't weep today, because there are people here and in many other places who really care about these issues and whose work often involves dealing with these issues. I want to close with a so-called biblical revelation supposedly discovered by an all-women team of archaeologists. In reality, it was written by a woman named Mary Chagnon, but it reflects, I think, how women and men of goodwill feel and act, and you will probably recognize the paraphrase. And they shall beat their pots and pans into printing presses and weave their cloth into protest banners. Nations of women shall lift up their voices with other women, neither shall they suffer discrimination anymore. Now that may sound apocryphal, but I suspect it may yet prove to come from the book of prophets. For what women and men of goodwill are learning is the politics of power and the politics of change, and the campus and the nation and the world will never again be the same. Thank you very much.
So we're going to take the next few minutes here. I'm going to open with a couple of questions for Dr. Sandler, and then we're going to open up to the floor because we think it's very important that you all have a chance to talk to this incredible woman. I would like to know, can you tell the story of how you earned the nickname Godmother of Title IX?
I was being interviewed by a reporter from the New York Times, and she said, "You're the mother of Title IX." And I said, "No, I'm not the mother. Edith Green is the mother, and Birchby is the father." She said, "Then what are you?" And so I thought about that, and then we came up with different things, and then one of us, and I no longer remember which one of us, said, "Godmother." So that is how I became the godmother of Title IX.
Can you tell us a little bit about, you've met several presidents, Lyndon Johnson being one of them. Can you just...
No, I didn't meet Lyndon
Oh, you
Johnson.
did not?
No.
I thought you did meet Lyndon. I thought I read that.
No. I met Clinton once at a reception, and went to a meeting with President Carter. Yeah, and I met with President Ford once. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about what you had mentioned up there about bullying, and just the issue today? Obviously, it's been around forever, but just your thoughts.
Yeah, there's a lot of interest now in bullying, particularly in schools, and that's really very, very good. But what people are missing is that some bullying is also sexual harassment. For example, I'm sure you all remember the young man at Rutgers who ended his life by killing himself because he had slept with another man in the room, et cetera, et cetera. That's a Title IX case, because Title IX prevents, not only covers sex discrimination on the basis of sex as such, women and men, but it also covers gender discrimination in terms of same-sex orientation and stuff, or assumed same-sex orientation. And that was a Title IX case as well. And why is this important? Because bullying is, almost every state has them now, I think, bullying laws, except maybe 2 or 3. State laws differ from state to state. So there's no agreed definition of bullying like there's only one definition under Title IX. Right. So there's no definition, and that's a problem. But more important is under federal law, you can sue. You can go right into court, and you can sue the institution. You don't need permission. You have to use the institution's procedures, but you have much more protection, and you can sue for more money than if you were doing employment discrimination. There are some limits as to how much, but Title IX is extraordinarily powerful. And I think when schools realize that some bullying, if it has any sexual content in it, it is a violation of federal law, they will begin to respond, I think, much more quickly. Right now, the penalties under most state laws are not, they're piddling. And so it becomes very important. If you want to look at it, this is how I sort of look at it. Here's a big circle. Size is irrelevant here, not related. Here's a circle that's bullying, and here's a circle that's sexual harassment. And at some point, those two circles intersect and cover each other. And that part in the middle is sexual bullying of one sort, or any kind of bullying that has any sexual content to it, whether it's sexual orientation or a woman being a slut or a guy being a fag or whatever they want to call people, and so forth. So it's extraordinarily important. I think we will, this is a prediction I'm making, we're going to see the Title IX coordinators, we will have a coordinator for sports in many, many places within the next 5 years. And that coordinator, among other things, will look at why football players have such a high incidence, not all of them, but the high incidence, along with fraternities, of sexually assaulting women. And the definition of sexual assault has changed. It's not forcible rape. It's rape without informed consent. And this is an area for research to look at in terms of the bullying that occurs within athletic programs.
We have time for a few questions. Some questions, please.
There's one over there. Yeah.
This isn't really a question, I apologize, but I think I can speak for everybody in this room. We are so happy that you came on too strong as a woman.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Sandler, for being here. There is still a lot to be done in higher education in terms of where women are. I teach in the Women's Studies program, and recently met with the Dean of Education, or of Arts and Sciences at our school, and with some students, and he actually told our department chair that she needed to be quiet because he had more to say than she did. My question to you is, where does it go now? We see a lot of assistant and associate professors, still not a lot of women full professors, still not as many women as we need in higher administration. Where do you see that going in the next few years based on that we're seeing so many more women in college.
Yeah. Well, I think what's going on is women's issues throughout history have risen and fallen and risen and fallen. And we're sort of towards the bottom of a trough right now. And we need to make women and men of goodwill, and there are lots of them now, discontented, unhappy with the situation, which means you have to get information about the situation and get it publicized. Because people don't change or push for change if they're comfortable. If you think of yourself as lying in bed, if you're comfortable, you just lie there. And then if you get uncomfortable, you sort of turn over or shift the pillow or something. And to raise the discontent of the people involved or people who care about those issues is the first major step. I'm thinking in sports, we really need to do Title IX audits. And there ought to be something either on the web or someplace, and I think the Women's Sports Foundation will be doing something like this, but I hope it's available to everyone and not just to NCAA organizations, but to everyone, where people, your local newspaper could, and that's a good way to start, to get the local newspaper to do, you count things. And you say, what's going on here? And if you get a good reporter, it's a good way to raise discontent. And then you have to figure out what strategies. And you just throw out one strategy. During interviews, this is one of the things we know from research. This is why I love researchers, because they think of things to research on that I would never think of. In interview, when men are speaking to women, and this is teachers as well as in interviews, and when women are speaking to women, but it's more with interviews and whoever's conducting the interview or leading the class, is men are more likely to be asked thinking critical questions. Women are asked more likely to get factual questions. So in an interview, for example, so what course are you teaching, Ms. Smith? I'm teaching 101. And what textbook are you using? I'm using the textbook. Okay, now Mr. Jones comes in and he's asked something like, so what do you think the most important issues are on our field right now? You can really shine on that one, and you can fake it if you don't know the answer. You can come up with it or whatever. But if you've got, just ask this question. If people know this, then you figure out in advance what you want them to know about you, and when they say what textbook you say, well, I'm using X, Y, and Z. And the reason I use that is I have a long-standing history of doing X, Y, and Z, and I'm this kind of person, whatever. And so you do that. So you can teach people, one, how they can respond, but you also make sure that interview committees have a baseline of questions which they ask everyone. They can still ask other things. So and people in academia, if you get a group of them together, they can figure out strategies. Because you're there and you know and you've seen and you can come up, get 5 people together for lunch or 20 people at a meeting and they'll come up with all kinds of strategies that can be used. But first you've got to get the awareness and then the strategies and figure out who has the power to make the changes and how do you get them, what power do they respond to. It takes time. It takes time and a lot of work, but it doesn't take a lot of people. At the beginning of Title, you should know I'm not the only one who worked on Title IX. There were a lot of unknown people, unsung heroes and heroines who really did a lot of work too. It doesn't take a lot of people, and you don't have to tell everybody how big your group is. When people would ask me how big WHEEL was, I was told by the group of people I worked with, you don't tell them, you say, we are growing so fast, we just can't keep track of the numbers. Which was, well, it was okay. Other questions? Yeah.
Dr. Sandler, hi. You mentioned in your talk that anyone who asked for an exemption got one. Father-daughter dances and sororities and fraternities are one thing, but one of the bigger carve-outs is for undergraduate admissions at private universities. Yeah. I wonder, was that a hard thing to give up in light of your concern about quotas?
Yeah, that was very hard, and it's the major exemption in Title IX. It came about because Harvard, Dartmouth, Princeton, and Yale, 3 of which had gone co-ed but with small quotas, and Dartmouth was planning to go co-ed. And it was clear that nobody could fight those 4 schools because a lot of their alumni are members of the Congress. So they arranged for what they call a colloquy, a discussion on the floor of the House to get the legislative history, which reads, the sexes learn better in different ratios. There's a shred of evidence in this. And we as administrators in higher education are the best people to know what those ratios should be. And Representative Green was smart enough, and her staff counsel was smart enough to make that admissions exemption very narrow, so that once you admit people of both genders in any proportion you want, from 0 to whatever, you can't discriminate after the person have been admitted. So if you decided you only wanted 5 women, you had to make sure they had every privilege that everyone else did. So it's interesting. That's very serious because right now, women were 40% of the students before Title IX, but once you end discrimination, they go up to 60%. And so you have some of the small privates who are very concerned about having a surplus of women. No one was concerned when there was a surplus of men, I might add here. And so what some of our fine private schools are actually doing, some have admitted it publicly, some have not, but they're actually admitting men who are lesser qualified than some of the women they are rejecting. So it's the major exemption for Title IX that really has made a difference. Harvard could stop admitting women tomorrow legally. They won't do it because politically it's not a wise thing, but any private undergraduate school can admit men and women in whatever proportions they want. So thank you for raising that one.
Do we have another question? Hello, Bunny.
I couldn't see you against the light there, Deb.
Okay. I was wondering about another exception. Maybe you could talk on. Right now there's an exception for participation in contact sports.
Oh, yeah. The whole sports thing is very difficult to deal with because you need some separate. Where it's separate, it should be equal. But how do you make football equal to other things? It gets hard to do to some degree. That exemption came from. I'm not sure if it was the secretary of the department or whether it was the head of OCR, but it was a male person fairly high up who said that basketball was a contact sport. I understand in basketball, contact is a foul. Am I right in that? Yes, I hope. You can tell my knowledge of basketball is a little limited. And he also he decided, therefore, that basketball was a contact sport. There was no official definition. People are, I think, worried about opening up too many things for change, particularly in this particular climate. Opening any of these rules up for change could be very dangerous. I'm not sure how, when Title IX was passed, the Congress had the power not to reject it, but they didn't have to vote for rejection. If they did nothing, it was accepted. And I think the rule has changed, and I'm sorry, I'm not familiar now. But it's been very hard. The regulation has been changed only once during the Bush administration for the single-sex schools, and I think the other one was they were allowing email surveys for women as an indicator of interest, which I don't know about you, but I practically never answer any surveys. And if you didn't answer the survey, that meant you weren't interested in women's sports. So it's a hard one because I think women do, we have girls wrestling, women wrestling, and it's time to change that. But I think it's going to be difficult until we have a different Congress and different people around. Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I just want to thank everybody, and I just feel so privileged to have been here at this conference, just mostly for today, and not all of that because I was busy rewriting as I always do. But I have to tell you, I learned a lot, and I had some new insights into Title IX and how we should be doing things and how things work. I spoke to a lot of people, and it was just an extraordinarily nice in terms of people and nice in terms of intellectual stimulation, and that's always a plus. So thank you very much.